There we go. Hi, folks. We are going to give everyone just a minute or two to join the webinar before we get started. All right, again, we're really excited to have everyone here. Thank you for joining the webinar. We're going to wait just one more minute as folks are still entering the waiting room. All right, Carly, does it seem like the flow has slowed?
A little bit, and I can keep letting folks in as you begin.
All right, well, I think we should probably get started. Again, thank you all very much for being here. This is the third of 3 webinars focused on the U.S. Forest Stewardship Standard, the FSC U.S. Forest Stewardship Standard version 2. And the topic for today is Workers' Rights and Wellbeing. So it's a focus on Principle 2 in the standard. Having had a look at the registration list, it looks like there may be some non-US folks joining the webinar today. So I do want to emphasize that the focus will be on the US specific forest stewardship standard and the requirements within it. These requirements should be very similar to other forest stewardship standards for other parts of the world, regions, countries. But because all of these standards are adapted to local context, there will be some slight differences, but generally the overall intent of what we're trying to achieve in terms of outcomes will be similar. Okay. So before we go any further, we'd like to invite you all and encourage you to consider joining us at some of our 2026 engagement events. We have 2 regional stakeholder events coming in March and April. In March, it's in Knoxville with a focus on the Appalachian region. And in April, it will be in Milwaukee with a focus on the Great Lakes region. For both of those, we have a half-day Forest Stewardship Standard workshop planned, and then an afternoon stakeholder meeting covering more FSC US wide topics. Each one of those has a meet and greet in the evening and also a field tour option on an adjacent day. We will be covering the same basic content for the FSS workshops in virtual formats in June. June 4 will have a focus on the Western region, and June 17 with more of a focus on the Eastern region. And then we also hope that you will consider joining us in October at the Stewardship in Action Conference. This is FSC US's annual conference. And this year we are working to actually have a session focused on labor issues, both forest management and chain of custody related, as part of or adjacent to the conference in October. All right. So for today, first of all, I want to introduce myself. My name is Amy Clark Eagle. I am the Director of Science and Certification for FSC US, and I'm joined by my colleague, Carly Evans, who is our Forest Management Specialist. We've been the two folks most recently working the most on the Forest Stewardship Standard approval process and now implementation, transition and implementation. We are recording the webinar, and the recording will be available publicly, including the Q&A sessions that we have throughout the webinar. We'll also make a copy of the slide deck available. These will all be on our FSC US webpage. We are asking that if you want to ask a question, to please use the chat function. This really helps us as we're looking back at what were the topics that generated the most questions or the most confusion, and helps us as we're working on providing better support in the future and updating our frequently asked questions document and things like that. We'll be stopping periodically, specifically to answer questions that have come up. It may be easier for someone at that point to raise a hand and ask their question verbally, but just for documentation purposes, it's really helpful if you put your questions in the chat. We have some polls throughout the session today, but also at the very end, we're asked that you please stay to complete one poll for sure, and the other is optional. But the first one is to give us some feedback on this webinar and how we're doing generally. And then the second poll is for those of you who may be interested in earning SAF CFE credit hours. This webinar has been approved for 1.5 hours. So you'll just need to put in your name and your SAF member number. So if you need a minute to figure that out, you now have 90 minutes or 80 minutes to figure it out. I did want to stop and hesitate for a second and just recognize this webinar will be slightly different from the two previous webinars that we did over the last couple of weeks. Obviously, we're only covering one topic today, as opposed to the other webinars that each had two topics. The topic of workers and labor related requirements was by far the number one topic in terms of requests for additional support and guidance and resources, and also for the webinars. So we wanted to make sure that we took plenty of time to do this. The second reason that this one's going to be a little bit different is that we'll be stopping in a number of places to ask you to give us some feedback on the things that we're talking about. Because guidance on the Principle 2 requirements was the number one requested resource when we've asked certificate and stakeholders what they would, most prefer us to be working on. By far and away, guidance on labor issues was the number one request. So that's kind of a big, broad topic. And with the polls today, we're really hoping that you'll be able to help us kind of narrow in on where the concerns are most significant and where maybe they're less significant, and therefore where we can kind of focus in and be more useful and helpful. So be prepared. It's all clicking buttons, but there will be polls throughout. For the agenda today, I'm going to spend a little bit of time, quick overview on the transition to version 2. If you were in the other webinars, you've already heard this, but this is for anyone who might be new with this webinar. Going to start with kind of a broad overview of Principle 2 and the topics covered within it, and then including an overview of the principle level guidance that's provided in the standard. And then moving into the means of verification, so help in terms of demonstrating conformance. That's also provided in the standard associated with Principle 2. And then we'll step into more of an indicator by indicator walkthrough of the Principle 2 requirements themselves. And then, as I said at the end, polls, wrap up. Please stay. We'd really appreciate your feedback on how we're doing. Okay. Before we go any further, a reminder that as participants in this meeting, we need to be mindful of the constraints of antitrust laws. There shall be no discussions of agreements or concerted actions that may restrain competition. This prohibition includes the exchange of information concerning individual prices, rates, and market practices, or any other competitive aspect of an individual company's operation. Each participant is obligated to speak up immediately for the purpose of preventing any discussion falling outside these bounds. So thank you for keeping this in mind. All right, so yes, version 2 of our US 4 Stewardship Standard was published on January 1. You can get it both through the FSC International website in their Documents Center or from the FSC US website. We have a FSS version 2 webpage. We've had some issues with a transition to a new website. I think we've gotten most of that resolved now, but Carly's going to drop a link, if she hasn't already, which she probably has, into the chat that will take you to that US webpage. Okay, so the transition to version 2. The version 2, like I said, version 2 was published on January 1. It becomes effective. That means that's the first date that could be potentially used for auditing is April 1 of this year. And then there is an 18-month transition period through September 30 of 2027. So the last date that the old standard can be used for auditing or any certification related purpose is that September 30, 2027. So what this means is that both standards, the old and the new, are valid during this 18-month transition period. And we'll come back to that in just a second. Okay, so what happens? Certificate holders are expected to continue their normal audit cycle and schedule of audits. Like I said, both standards are valid for audits, and this might potentially mean that some certificate holders could possibly have 2 audits during that 18-month transition time. If this happens, technically it's up to you and your CB to decide which of the standards you're going to use for the auditing for each one of those audits during the transition period. All certificate holders need to have their first version 2 audit during the transition period. And by the end of the transition period, all certificate holders need to conform with the new and revised indicators of the standard if they want to continue to be certified. So what I didn't say at the top was that if you're supposed to have a surveillance audit, you'll have it. If you're supposed to have a recertification audit, you'll have it. If by chance the first audit that you have to version 2 is a surveillance audit, it's possible that your CB will decide to not, in fact, audit all of the new and changed indicators. And they have this flexibility. They can look at it in terms of kind of which are the indicators that they feel there's a higher risk of nonconformance that they need to be more concerned about. And it's possible if there are some that are considered to be a lower risk, those could be audited after the transition period ends. You still need to be in conformance before the transition period ends, but you may not be audited to that indicator until a later date. The other thing to note that's important is that all major nonconformances, and yes, that's major, not minor, all major nonconformances must be closed by the end of the transition period. If this hasn't happened, then your auditor, your CB, is unable to make a certification decision. And so you would not yet be certified to the new standard. And when the old standard expires at the end of the transition period, you're not certified to anything. So you would lose your certification at that point. So all major nonconformances need to be closed. Minor nonconformances will be handled on the normal cycle and process. I think. Oh, I just wanted to highlight one quick thing. But before I do that, the CB calibration process, we are engaged with the certification bodies that are active in the United States and a couple that would like to be active in the United States to work through issues that have been identified by the CBs as potential calibration issues, places where there might be the possibility of having different interpretations or approaching audits in different ways, and we want to get those as similar as possible between CBs and between auditors. As part of that, wanted to reflect that we may not be able to answer all questions today. Certainly, if there are things that come up that we need to dig into a little bit more, we'll do that. There also may be some things that come up that really should go into this CB calibration process. So we'll flag some of those as we go, I expect. Okay, not going to go into detail here, but I do want to highlight that there are a lot of resources available on the webpage that Carly dropped into the chat box. Some of those we added in December, and then they disappeared as we were transitioning to the new website, but they have been re-added. So there's a lot of resources there, and we really encourage you to check them out. And this includes that schedule of events and links to registration when they are available. Okay, before moving on, Carly, have we got any questions?
We have one clarifying question. You mentioned that if you're due for a surveillance audit, it's possible you won't be audited to all of the new and changed indicators, but just clarifying, you still need to be in conformance with all of the new and changed indicators, right?
Yes, you have to be in conformance with all of the new and changed indicators before the end of the transition period. Your auditor may or may not choose to audit some of those lower risk items during your first audit to the V2 standard. If they audit them at a later date after the transition period has closed, they may ask you to provide evidence or in some way demonstrate that you were in fact in conformance before the end of the transition period.
Thanks. That's all for now.
Cool. All right, so principle 2. Before getting into any of the content, I did want to reflect that ensuring the health, safety, rights, and overall well-being of workers has been a core value of FSC from the very beginning. It's been reflected in all of the different versions of the FSC principles and criteria. So this is something that's been part and ingrained into FSC force management certification from the beginning. The most recent version of the principles and criteria has taken all or most of the worker-related indicators and pulled them into a single principle, principle 2, and has added some additional requirements and kind of filled out that principle with some additional elements as well. This is, previously it was all just mixed in with the other social values. So we are going to get into, I'm going to start with the overview. And if you remember from the agenda, we're then going to go into a little bit around ideas for how to potentially demonstrate conformance, and then get to the detailed principle 2 kind of indicator level requirements in the next 2 sections. So we're not going to get into all the details right now. You may have some lingering questions that we'll hopefully answer as we get further down. So I just wanted to remind and highlight that aspect. Okay. So overall, I do want to recognize that Principle 2 was one of the most difficult principles for the standard development group to work on. They tried out a couple of different approaches. The version 1 approach was to have different indicators that were applicable to different types of workers. There were some indicators that were applicable to employees of a certified organization. There were some indicators that were more applicable to all workers, and there were some that were only applicable to contractors and other contracted workers. The SDG was really trying to find a path forward that addressed the many concerns that they had received about information and engagement related to contracted workers, and ensuring that certified organizations aren't being asked by the standard to cross or go anywhere near some of the legal thresholds that exist, particularly related to misclassification of employees. Overall, there's really not a big change in the definition of workers. It's how it's been applied as a term and a concept within the standard itself, and particularly in Principle 2. So whereas the old standard had kind of different types of workers addressed in different indicators, in the revised standard, all of the indicators where the term worker is used, those indicators are applicable to all different types of workers, whether they're employees or contracted workers or other types of workers. And obviously there's a greater number of worker-oriented indicators overall. Some of the new requirements there's a pretty explicit requirement around parental leave requirements. There's requirements for having mechanisms to address harassment and bullying, a requirement to demonstrate that accident levels are low or declining, and a requirement to consider the different types of factors that might affect costs for contractors when negotiating contracts. And we'll come back to those as part of the last section that's more detailed, but I just was going to highlight here some of those more significant changes. Okay, again, a little bit of laying some foundations here. Workers, it's all employed persons who are implementing management activities and working within the management unit as kind of a gross summary of the definition that's there. We've got a number of different places where discrimination comes into play, and the discrimination covers, as you can see in the definition, a broad range of different types of potential topics or issues on which discrimination might occur. But the overall idea is that it's avoiding anything which might nullify or impair the ability to have equity of opportunity and treatment in employment or occupation. The management unit comes into play because we're talking about people who are working within the management unit. This is the same definition that we've had for some time. It's basically the places that are certified and the places that may not be adjacent to that spatial area, but are operated solely for the purpose of contributing to management objectives, excuse me. The management plan, it's that the document or collection of documents where we have statements of objective and policies. And management activity is the broad range of activities that are occurring as for the purpose of managing the certified area. In Principle 2, there are 6 criteria. Excuse me. Okay. Criterion 2.1, if you happen to also hold a certificate for chain of custody and you're familiar with the core labor requirements, Criterion 2.1 has indicators that are very, very similar with the FSC chain of custody core labor requirements. And the focus is on upholding the fundamental principles and rights at work as defined by ILO. This includes child labor, forced labor, discrimination, and rights to associate and collectively bargain. We recognize in the standard that the elements of Criterion 2.1 are fully aligned with federal law. We've done the compare and contrast and the crosswalking there. So compliance with law would in fact result in conformance with Criterion 2.1. For Criterion 2.2, this is one of those new emphases, maybe that's a word, or topics, which is around promoting gender equity in employment practices, training opportunities, awarding of contracts, processes of engagement, and management activities. The term equality is used in the criterion, but the SDG chose to use the term equity in all of the indicators. And just a note that the indicators are written to cover all genders equally. So they're in the IGIs, the International Generic Indicators. There's some that call out women or men, but these are written to cover all genders in the same way. Criterion 2.3 is about implementing health and safety practices to protect workers from occupational safety and health hazards. The majority of the requirements in Criterion 2.3 are also covered by compliance with federal law. There's one element that may or may not be, but generally the focus is on standard practices that are already legally required. Criterion 2.4, it's about paying wages that meet or exceed minimum forced industry standards or other forced work industry wage agreements or living wages if higher than legal minimum wages. So we do have typically forced industry standards are higher than the legal minimum wages. And so the focus is on that aspect in Criterion 2.4. Wanted to make a note, and I'll say this again later. The Standard Development Group's interpretation of Criterion 2.4, which starts out with the language something like the organization pays wages. And the Standard Development Group interpretation is that because of that language, this criterion is only applicable to the organization itself and to the people to whom they pay wages, i.e. their employees, and is not applicable more broadly to contractors or contracted employees. For Criterion 2.5, it's about training and supervision and demonstrating that the workers who are implementing the management plan and the management activities have the training and supervision necessary for what they're doing. There's not explicit things that need to have training included in this criterion and in the indicators. Instead, there's a reference to Annex E, which provides kind of a laundry list of the many different types of training that might be applicable. Not everything has to be done, and there's recognition that it will be context specific in terms of what's happening, and therefore what types of training would be appropriate. And then Criterion 2.6, the criterion is about having mechanisms for resolving grievances and providing fair compensation to workers. There are actually no indicators in Criterion 2.6. The Standard Development Group chose to lump together the requirements for Criterion 1.6, Criterion 2.6, Criterion 4.6, and a piece, a small part of one of the indicators, and I think Criterion 3.2. And these are all focused on resolving disputes, providing fair compensation. And so they've been lumped into all into the indicators of Criterion 1.6, which is about the dispute resolution framework. And because that one is not really a worker-specific thing, we're not going to be diving into the details of that one today. Okay, so like I said, there's some broad guidance at the beginning of Principle 2. It recognizes that the indicators are intended to achieve similar outcomes for all workers that are in scope for that criterion. That it's possible to demonstrate conformance in different ways for different types of workers. So even if you're working on demonstrating conformance for one particular indicator, it might be that you do it in different ways for different types of workers. There's an emphasis on activities that are achieving management objectives. So they're part of the management activities, but that occur after the transfer of ownership. They're still occurring in the management unit, but occur after the transfer of ownership. Those are still management activities. And so therefore the Principle 2 indicators apply to workers engaged in those types of activities. There's also a recognition that if you are contracting with an organization, a company that has some other kind of non-FSC third-party verified certification that addresses social issues, it's possible that that certification might be adequate for demonstrating conformance with some or all or a number of the Principle 2 indicators. And then finally, just recognition that because contractors and contractor employees are part of the workers who are in the management unit implementing management activities, the certification body, your auditor, might reach out to these folks and either ask for information or ask for staff interviews. And it might be of value to consider either giving your contractors heads up that this could be happening or even putting language into your contract with them. Okay. And I am behind by a couple of minutes, but I think we've got time for some questions. We'll make time. If we got anything, Carly?
We have one question about regarding the living wage. Have we defined a specific living wage framework? Because there's several different ones, or how? Yes.
Yeah, so the indicators, we'll come to that. The indicators in, I think that's criterion 2.3 or 2.4. The indicators do not use the term living wage. Instead, they're focused on industry norms in the area of the management unit, or industry standards in the area of the management unit. And there's a backstop provided if it's not possible to figure out what those are. So the indicators do not include a reference to living wage. We were able to demonstrate as part of the development and approval process that when you looked at, I think we were using a living wage calculator that was from University of Washington, I think. And if you looked at that and compared it to the data from the US government, that there was pretty comparable numbers provided. And when there were differences, it was not really major significant.
Thanks. And are we going to get into the one safety requirement that might not align with this law later on?
There's one indicator which has one element, which is probably, it may not be addressed by the laws. So we'll talk about that. Or maybe you can tell me, maybe it is. Maybe I'm that's not my area of expertise. So there we go.
We have one quick question, which is sort of broad. Are contractors or their employees compelled to provide information to auditors during the audit process, or is it their choice? And I think that's sort of what we're talking about with how to provide conformance coming up.
Yeah, exactly. The certificate holder is the entity that has responsibilities related to providing evidence that demonstrates their conformance. The scope of conformance includes workers who are not employees, who are in the management unit and implementing management activities. So there is a need for the certificate holder to figure out how they're going to engage with those contractors and or work in a kind of bilateral way with their CB to ensure that the CB has the information that they need to fully assess conformance. So we're going to get into some of the ideas here on how that might be possible. The contractors do not sign any kind of agreement with FSC or with the CBs. So I would say there's no compelling unless you as a certificate holder put it into your contract that they have to, then I guess then there might be some kind of legal obligation. Okay, so I think let's keep going now and we can come back to questions. Does that sound okay, Carly? Yeah, okay. So when you get to principle 2 in the standard, when you get to after all of the indicators, there's a big guidance box and it's all about means of verification. And there are, I think it's 13 different specific suggestions for how the verification or how you can demonstrate conformance. Again, there's that explicit recognition that you might use different types of verifiers for different types of workers. There's also a recognition that it might be that a single verifier might not be adequate to demonstrate conformance. It might require a suite of verifiers. That'll be a conversation between you and your CB about what's adequate for conformance. There are kind of 3 categories. I just noticed today that in the final document, there's a formatting screw up. So the 3rd category is not as obvious, but there are 3 categories of initial options or ideas that are presented in the standard. And there's one that focuses on potential ideas for all workers, demonstrating conformance for all workers, some that are more specific to contracted employees, and some that are more specific to employees of the organization itself. As I said at the beginning, the #1 request for resources from FSC US had to do with additional guidance and or support tools specifically related to demonstrating conformance or related to principle 2, and particularly about demonstrating conformance with contractors in mind. So this is something that we're aware of is a critical need and something on which we are working. There are, like I said, 3 categories. The first category was potential verifiers for all workers. Many of these are things that are already used. Field observations made by the auditor, interviews with workers conducted by the auditor, potentially consultation with stakeholders to find out if there are known issues or concerns that need to be flagged, and that could be by either the CB or the certificate holder. The use of publicly available data from sources that are considered, reliable and can be verified. Any records of disputes, potentially the ability to demonstrate we have not had any disputes submitted into our dispute resolution framework or process from workers. That could be part of a suite of information used to demonstrate conformance. Partnerships between the certificate holder and organizations that support whistleblowers, being able to demonstrate, look, we're doing what we can to ensure that workers have an opportunity to identify and highlight concerns that they may have. And partnerships between the certificate holder and other entities that would result in progressive compliance. In other words, improving conditions over time. So using this with a suite of other indicators most likely, not on its own, but this could be part of demonstrating that the certificate holder, the certified organization, is working on all of these issues and ensuring that the workers' rights and well-being are being upheld and managed in a conformance manner. So specifically for employees, this one did not seem to have nearly as much concern. And it's about mostly, being able to provide your auditor with documentation, many different types of documents that might be of value for that. Could also include doing anonymous surveys of employees regarding working conditions or any particular condition with which there might be a concern. And then moving into the ideas that were included in the standard for verifiers related to contracted workers. This is a repeat of the guidance that was at the beginning of the principle, which is contracting with companies that have been verified by another certification scheme that might have addressed some or all of the applicable indicators. Considering contracts that written into the contract, there's a demonstration of commitment to treat workers in compliance with law, and then combined with an effective process to monitor and enforce contract compliance. Similarly, contracts that address particular elements, some or all of the elements of this, and it says this criterion, I think I meant to put this principle, apologies, combined with an effective process to monitor and enforce contract compliance. And so those are both kind of two pieces, writing it into the contract and then demonstrating that there's a process to ensure that there's compliance with the contract. Potentially using profiles or assessments of contractors, if there's any kind of publicly available data or other sources of external data that could help to evaluate the risk, the overall performance of contractors, particularly related to their workers. So these are the ideas. There's also another that comes from the chain of custody side of things that could be a potential addition here, which would be thinking about asking your contractors to complete self-assessments related to the different topics covered by Principle 2, and then ask them to provide, to be willing to engage with your auditor, with your CB, if the CB asks for additional information or evidence related to those self-assessments. That might be another way to go about this. So with that, this is one of the places where we're looking for your input. And thank you, Carly. She's put up the poll. So the poll has two questions. And the 13 verifiers are listed out twice. And the first question is, if you could go through and just kind of tag those, and we realize you haven't necessarily had a lot of time to think about this or evaluate this or talk to others within your organization. But if you'd be willing in the first question to go through and tick those that just kind of appear like they might be the most feasible in terms of demonstrating conformance to P2 requirements. And the second question would be if you would be willing to do the same thing, but tick the boxes for the verifiers that you think would be the least feasible. And this really helps us because it helps us kind of think about, where are the places where maybe we can lean in a little bit more and kind of investigate a bit more, or be able to elaborate more in guidance, or look for other similar types of options or ideas or best practices when it comes to demonstrating conformance. And if there's a lot of words all mushed together, I think you can actually drag the box and make it wider so that you can see more all at once. Okay, Carly, I was hoping we'd get to about 60% participation. Oh, we're there. Oh, it's growing. That's even better.
It looks like a couple of people are still answering number 2, so I'm gonna wait just another 20 seconds.
Awesome. All right, we good?
Yeah, let's move on. Lots of folks are still answering, but we got lots to get through, so thanks for your responses, guys.
Yeah, we really, really appreciate it. Okay. So, but we do have some time for questions.
It does seem like most of the questions that we've had are more of the detailed questions that we'll get to when we dive into indicator by indicator.
Okay. All right, so maybe at this point we do the dive.
Let's dive in.
All righty. Awesome. Okay, so for this walkthrough, we're going to go through each criterion and the indicators of each criterion. I want to call out on the slides themselves, the indicators are summarized. It's not the language verbatim from the standard. And obviously, when you have an audit, the audit is always going to be to that original indicator in the standard. But I've tried to hit on the kind of the key aspects of each indicator on these slides. There are few adaptations for family forests. There's a couple of indicators that have an alternative family forest indicator, and there's a couple of indicators that are not applicable for family forests. But generally, the conformance for all types of management units is required for most of the indicators in Principle 2. Again, just a quick reminder, we're not going to cover Criterion 2.6 because those requirements are addressed via the indicators of Criterion 1.6. So it's not really a labor worker focused set of indicators. Okay. All right, so the first one, again, is about the fundamental principles and rights at work as defined by the International Labor Organization. The scope of this criterion is all workers, so the indicators would apply to all workers. However, as previously noted, the indicators are all aligned with federal law, so compliance with federal law should cover all aspects of Criterion 2.1. You still have to demonstrate that compliance or conformance, but you should be good if you're in compliance with law. So 2.1 child labor is not used. This recognizes in particular that hazardous work is not part of what a child may be doing. There are some exceptions provided for generally for children less than 17 years, but there's also some limitations. There's a higher age threshold, and these are the definition of child labor in the glossary is from US legislation. There's also a definition of hazardous work and all of the kind of related elements to child labor. And that's been aligned, like I said, with the federal legislation. So if you are in compliance with legislation, you should be good. Forced or compulsory labor is eliminated, is the second indicator. The standard has a little bit of language around the use of prison labor. Prison labor does not automatically mean forced or compulsory labor. It can, but it doesn't have to be. And so there's some guidance there associated with indicator 212 around when prison labor would be a legitimate source of labor and when it would be something that would not be allowed for FSC certification. 213, excuse me, there's no discrimination in employment and occupation. We talked a little bit about discrimination before in terms of the definition. Covers a very broad range of potential topics that could affect equity in employment and occupation. And then the fourth indicator is that workers' freedom of association and rights to collectively bargain are respected. This indicator has 4 sub-indicators that get a little bit into the details. So part of this is ensuring that workers are able to establish or join unions in accordance with law, that they're not discriminated against or punished for any union-related activities, or even if they choose to refrain from union-related activities, and that any negotiations with unions are completed in good faith and with best efforts to achieve collective bargaining agreements, and that if collective bargaining agreements are developed, formed, that they're implemented. So these are the 4 indicators in criterion 2.1, again, aligned with federal law. So with that, if you would please pop up the 2.1 poll, that would be awesome. So we're just looking here. If you could check the boxes on any of these indicators or indicate none that are of particular concern to you. And Carly, I realized that I had intended to put in these polls a question around whether the concerns were more related to employees, contracted workers, or all workers. So if you remember, let's kind of ask that question when we get to the end, if we have the time. If folks have concerns around indicators related to employees, that would be worth knowing, or if the real source of concern is the contracted workers.
All right, we've already got 80% participation. Should we move on?
Fantastic. Let's move on. Well, it just shifted. All right, cool. Okay, criterion 2.2. So this is one of those topics that's kind of new. More, the discrimination was covered under the old standard. This has a bit more of new elements to it. The first indicator is being able to demonstrate that gender equity is promoted and gender discrimination prevented in the many different aspects of management related to the management unit and the management activities. This is one of the indicators that has a family force indicator. And the family forest indicator is focused more directly on compliance with laws related to gender discrimination. Indicator 2.2, oh, I didn't say, and my understanding is that the SDG viewed this this criterion to have a scope of all workers. The second indicator is around parental leave practices, and for most organizations, this is would be addressed through compliance with law. However, it does specify that even if it's not legally required, a minimum of 6 weeks is provided for parental leave following the birth of a child. And just a reminder that the indicators in this apply equally to all genders, not just one, a particular gender. The third indicator, confidential and effective mechanisms exist for preventing, reporting, and addressing sexual harassment, sexual discrimination, and workplace harassment or bullying. Again, this is one of the indicators that has a alternate family forest indicator. And again, that family forest indicator is focused principally on compliance with law related to sexual harassment and sexual discrimination. I believe that's the focus. The fourth indicator is around equal pay when the individuals are doing the same job, with consideration of the experience of the different individuals, their performance over time, the qualifications that they hold, the skills that they demonstrate, and the responsibilities they have or have had. So some considerations, but given those considerations, individuals of all genders are paid equally and are paid using a direct and secure method of payment. This fourth indicator is not applicable for family forest management units. Okay, so with that, pulling up the criterion 2.2 poll. As you're thinking about these polls and your concerns, think about whether, it doesn't matter if it's a concern related to the indicator itself, or if it's a concern related to demonstrating conformance with the indicator. We're just looking for some help on where to focus our time and attention when it comes to developing guidance.
Amy, as folks are responding, a question did come in. Does the indicator language require that parental leave is paid, or is it just a requirement for time off, such as FMLA?
The indicator itself does not address payment during parental leave. I'm trying to remember if there is anything in the glossary related to parental leave. And I don't think there is. So I don't think that payment during parental leave is covered or addressed or within the scope of the indicators.
Hey, Amy, I'm just going to come off mute and make a comment here. I think when you write up guidance to this, please write up guidance to ask certificate holders to include someone from HR in their organization as a function of this audit, where this is like so new to everyone that the auditors really shouldn't be asking necessarily the certificate manager how this all goes. But the easiest thing to do is the person who does some of those functions within an organization that is a certificate holder, very commonly that person, like, they may not even know that the forest manager gets FSC certified, but they are the right person to answer what happens, right? And I think that it goes without saying that, all the COC audits, that's where this had to go when this was added. But FM audits may not have had to do that yet. So that's probably your first part of guidance.
All right. So include a recommendation that as part of audits, you have an HR manager there to help deal with in particular, the Criterion 2.2 issues. Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Appreciate it. Thank you, Ross. Okay, Carly, are we about there?
Yeah, just ended the poll.
Awesome. Okay. Criterion 2.3 covers health and safety practices. As this one scope all workers. I will note that we've done a kind of a postmortem on 12 or 13 years of audits to the old standard. And by far and away, the indicator or indicators that had the most non-conformances over that time period were the ones related to health and safety of workers. So this is an area that's important. Obviously, they're all important, but this is a place where we know that there has been a history of non-conformance. The first indicator is focused on compliance with law. All of the elements in the international generic indicators related to the health and safety practices, for the most part, were covered by federal law. So we were able to focus the indicator on laws, but we have included those sub elements to ensure that there's recognition that this is part of compliance with the federal law. So including ensuring that there's safe workplace conditions, use of PPE when applicable, record keeping, establishing, updating, communicating about safety procedures, and doing your after action reviews and improving procedures after there's been a major incident or accident. The second one, and I remember there was a question about this, the thing that might not be covered by federal law, obviously maintaining records of workplace accidents and injuries is typically is covered by OSHA or by your state level OSHA legislation, I believe, in all situations. But there is an additional requirement there that you're able to use these records to demonstrate that the frequency and severity of accidents over time either remains low or is declining. And this is the piece that I don't believe, or I'm not sure whether that is covered by federal law or not. So hopefully that answers the question that was previously asked. And then we have a quickie poll on Criterion 2.3. All right, looks like we've got a pretty stable number now, Carly. We can give it another couple of seconds, but should probably move on. Okay, awesome. Okay, Criterion 2.4. And this is the one that I mentioned that because of the language and the way that the language of the criterion is written, it's the organization, wages paid by the organization, I believe, is the way that it starts. And so obviously the organization is not going to be paying wages to the contractor or to contractors' employees. So the SDG wrote these indicators with a scope in mind of this scope applying, of this criterion applying to employees and not to other workers. The first one, and there was a question around living wages. And so this is the indicator 241 is what I'd point to and say, because we have legal minimum wages and there are ways to evaluate prevailing wages for the forest industry, it was not necessary to include elements around development of an understanding around living wages with workers. So this is the indicator that focuses on kind of the level of wages. You need to meet or exceed both any legal minimum wages that are in place, whether it's federal, state, local, whatever, and demonstrate that you're meeting or exceeding the prevailing wages for the forest industry in your area. There is a kind of an additional verbiage. I didn't include it here just for space in the indicator, which notes that if prevailing wages cannot be determined, the finest scale applicable data that's reported by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics for farming, fishing, and forestry wages would be used. So there is a fallback there for how to determine prevailing wages. If you're unable to do it yourself, there's a fallback for the using US federal data. The second indicator is payment on time for wages, salaries, and contracts. And the third indicator is a new one. This was added by the Standard Development Group due to stakeholder concerns that were communicated via the public consultations and the other engagement opportunities that were held during the FSS revision process. And this one says that the certificate holder needs to negotiate contracts in good faith and consider factors that affect the costs for the contractor, including expectations for conformance with the standard. So what they're going to have to do to help you as a certificate holder conform with the standard, investments in equipment and other factors such as economic inflation, remoteness of the work site, and difficulty of the work. And noting again that this is another one of the indicators that is not applicable for family forest management units. All right, and some polls, poll here.
Amy, we did have a question earlier about means of verification for this criteria specifically. A certificate holder is wondering if auditors will need to see specific salaries of employees.
That is not a question that I am capable of answering. But I certainly think that this is something that Carly, you and I can take to our calibration discussions with the CBs around what kinds of information or data are adequate for these particular indicators. My memory is that there was an indicator in the old standard related to employees and wages. I believe the language is somewhat similar for indicator 241. And so generally would expect that the types of evidence that were used for demonstrating conformance to that old indicator would likely be, similar to what would be needed now for the indicator in this version 2 standard. if we're good, we can move to the next one.
All right.
Okay, criterion 2.5, job-specific training and supervision is the broad category. Like I said before, the scope here is, again, all workers. Like I said before, Annex E provides a list of the types of training that might be applicable. There are separate lists for family forest management units and non-family forest management units. Technically, that annex is considered normative because it's referenced in an indicator, which is normative. But there's text, there's language at the beginning of the annex recognizing that, what's necessary will be context specific, and therefore not every element of that annex would be necessary for conformance. It's about indicator. The first indicator is about being able to demonstrate that that workers who are implementing management activities within the management unit have the training and supervision necessary to do their work safely and effectively. And the second one is about record keeping and maintaining documentation around worker training. And this is the final indicator here with a family forest adaptation. This one is not applicable for family forest management units. So this poll has 3 questions. The first one is that question you've seen for all of the other criteria on kind of level of concern about particular indicators. And then there's a second question, which is just asking you to reflect on your overall level of concern related to Principle 2 requirements. And then the third question is asking you to rank, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the criteria in terms of your level of concern. So really, really appreciate you providing feedback on these. Like I said before, it will be extremely helpful for us as we are looking at where we put our time and resources and where we focus when it comes to the additional guidance that we provide for conformance with P2 requirements.
We have a number of questions that we will get to in the next Q&A section, but one just came in that is specifically related to 2.5, so I'll go ahead and ask that now. Will certificate holders be required to keep records such as name and training date, topic, etc. for contracted workers?
So this is one of those situations where if, as an organization, you have concern that asking for that kind of information could put you in some kind of legal liability or jeopardy, then that you need to be thinking about alternative means of being able to demonstrate that the people employed by the contractors are also receiving the necessary training and supervision. This could be by asking your contractor to make those kinds of records available to the CB if asked by the auditor. It could be that there are some of those other verifiers at the beginning. A suite of those other verifiers might cover in terms of using publicly available data, conducting assessments of the contractors being able to demonstrate that these are good contractors, there haven't been overall concerns about them, that there may be a way to use a suite of some of those verifiers to provide the level of assurance of evidence needed, so that you as a organization are not asking for that kind of information. All right, Carly, let me know when you think we're good, because I want to ask one more, the thing we talked about before. I want to ask one more question before we move on.
Yeah, I think we'll go ahead and end this one.
Okay. So I had meant to, for each one of the criterion level polls, I completely blanked on this. I had meant to also ask a question of whether that concern was related to employees, contracted workers, or all workers. And it would be really helpful if you guys would be willing to just drop into the chat, one of the, generally across these criteria, is this still, are we talking about concerns with the indicators related to all workers? Are we mostly talking about concerns related to contracted workers? Or are there some where there's still concerns that are more focused on employees themselves? And if you could just kind of drop thoughts like that into the chat, that would be really, really helpful to us. Because again, it helps us focus the work that we're doing to be able to provide additional guidance. Thank you all. Really, really appreciate it. I see the responses coming in. All right, I know that made your job a little bit harder, Carly, because the questions are up further in the chat, but let's see what we can do. Let's spend about 8 minutes, 7-8 minutes is needed on questions, and then we can do our final closing polls.
Yeah. We have a broad question about applicability of P2. Questions about how far-reaching the scope is, considering the definition of worker, that the definition of worker seems to include all employees of the organization, even if they're not working on FSC specific things, or non-forest management work. Are areas outside of FSC management and forestry fair game for audits and conformance?
Yeah, so I would say that the focus of all of this is intended to be related to what's happening within the management unit and associated with the management plan, the management objectives, and the management activities. It's not explicitly only related to specifically conformance with the standard. The SDG had initially evaluated trying to define management activity to being only those things that were related to conformance with the standard. This was a concern because then it had unintended consequences in other parts of the standard. So the focus is kind of framed out, and the scope is framed out primarily by these aspects of what's happening within the management unit. The definition of worker itself is not limited. So I do expect that most of the focus in terms of auditing will be on relationship to the other things that are happening in terms of conformance with the standard and management activities. that are happening for the purpose of conformance with the standard or that are aligned with the standard. But there is not an explicit scope defined that limits to only activities implemented for conformance with the standard.
Thank you. We have a couple questions about incident reporting. Specifically, what defines a low incident rate, or what happens if incidents are not declining? Maybe for several years there's none, but then 1 year there's 3.
Yeah, I think that this is a place where let me see if I can find that indicator. The standard development group very definitely did not want to suggest that you had to get down to 0, because that's just not feasible or reasonable. I think that's why the focus on remaining low, meaning that there may be some ups and downs, little ups and downs, but generally you're remaining low, or declining, meaning that if it isn't low, that there's a trend towards declining. In terms of thresholds, or what does low mean? There is not a definition, and there is not an explicit threshold. So, Carly, I guess we need to note that this is another place where we likely will need to talk to CBs about calibration on this particular one.
Thank you. Also, since we're in 2.3, there is a question about 2.3.1. Are there certain illnesses that need to be documented? Like how broad is that scope?
It's not explicit in the indicator itself. Generally, these have been related to resulting from the work that the worker is doing. So injuries and illnesses associated with the workplace is my understanding of the overall intent here.
Thank you. Another question is about 2.4.3 and how that might be audited. Do we have guidance about what sort of evidence would apply to this one specifically?
No, this is a brand new indicator, nothing similar in the old standard. So I'll make a note of this one also, that it's come up and something that we should be discussing with the CBs. Hey, what else have we got? I know I made your life hell sorting between the responses to my question and the question.
No, it's all right. There is a lot of comments and questions about, this bigger question of verifying conformance for contractors, without moving into the categorizing them as employees line. So we do know that's the big hot topic here, and we want to be able to help make sure that that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I will reflect on it. There's not going to be a silver bullet. I don't think that there's going to be an easy resolution here. But we do definitely want to provide additional support, guidance, tools. We're still working through what this might look like on this to ensure that folks are being held to similar bars. There's not an inequity in that sense between certificate holders. We also want to ensure that we are supporting credible conformance, and that the intent of all this related to workers' health, safety, and well-being and rights are being upheld as a result. So, yeah, we're working on it, but it's not going to be a black and white easy solution for any of us, I don't think.
I think we might have answered all of the questions. Yes, there's just some general concerns coming through, which are things that we've already talked about, but I'm glad that we've invited everybody to write notes in the chat, because this is really helpful for Amy and I, for understanding what we need to focus on moving forward.
I think since we're getting close to time, hello. If there are additional questions that come up, Carly, I'm happy to keep talking, but let's get the poll going. We'll leave this one open. This has 3 questions for feedback for FSC US in terms generally about this event itself. And then there's one related to that. How likely are you to recommend similar events to others? And then the third one is specific about kind of how we're doing. This is mainly Carly and me, and how we're doing in terms of our support for you, certificate holders and other stakeholders, thus far related to the transition from the old Forest Stewardship Standard to the revised one, version 2. And then after we close this poll, we will open the poll for those of you who would like to request SAF CFE credit hours. And we can leave that one open for a bit as well, if anyone is still searching for their SAF member number. And Michelle Mateo, if you're on this webinar, you still haven't sent me your number from the last webinar. But I suppose if you put it here, then I can.
Wait, sorry. You know, I think
that would make a lot of sense.
I already picked it up. I'm all good.
Yep. The SAF poll is not yet up. We'll get that up there in just a second. Okay, how are we doing, Carly?
Seems like maybe 20 more seconds. Let's see.
Okay. All right. While we're waiting, thank you all so very, very much for joining us today. Really, really appreciate you being here. We really, really appreciate your feedback, helping us out and navigating through all this. We do want to provide a framework, like I said, that's both credible for ensuring these values that are important to FSC, but also feasible for ensuring that we aren't making FSC certification impossible for our existing certificate holders or potential future certificate holders. So thank you for engaging, and thank you for your help, which helps us help you. So with that, thank you. Carly's put up the SAF credit, CFE credit hours request. And after this webinar, we will be submitting the information on all of the requests for all 3 webinars at the same time. So that will go into SAF this week. Looks like there's a question. Yes, we closed the feedback to FSC window. I'm sorry if we cut off anyone who is in the process of answering. We can't have two polls open at the same time in Zoom, unfortunately. And recognizing that we were getting to the end of time, needed to get the SAF one open.
If there is feedback that you want to share with us that you weren't able to, our emails are open and we want to be able to provide you guys with the best support we can. So any feedback is helpful if you want
Yes.
to emails.
100%. It looks like our SAF is still growing. However, at this point, I think I'm gonna turn off the recording. Carly.
Thanks for your participation.